Hey guys, so welcome back to another video. In this one I'm going to talk about the exposure triangle. I'm going to talk over it pretty basically really, just so you get an understanding of how it all works. So the exposure triangle is made up of three different settings. It's the shutter speed, aperture and ISO. So these are the settings you need to know to be able to start shooting in manual mode and take control of your exposures. The first setting I will talk about is shutter speed. Now this has essentially two functions. The first one is it controls the amount of light that you let through your lens. So for example, in this video clip I've got the exposure set at what the camera's telling me the correct exposure should be. So as I increase the speed, you'll be able to see the scene gets darker and becomes underexposed. And if I go the opposite way and do a slower shutter speed, you'll see that the scene gets brighter, but then you start to blow out your highlights and overexpose the image. So the second function of shutter speed is to capture movement. And there are two ways you can do this. You can shoot a fast shutter speed and freeze the movement of a certain subject, or you can shoot at slower shutter speeds and actually blur the movement. So typically I'll use fast shutter speeds when I'm doing my wildlife photography, which has generally been photographing birds and birds in flight, mostly small birds, which require quite a fast shutter speed. So I typically shoot at least 2/1000ths of a second, if not faster, for the small birds when photographing them in flight. So I'll put some images up of birds in flight. So if we slow things down a bit and use slower shutter speed, you can create long exposures. So if you're photographing waterfalls, rivers, streams, or you're at the coast and doing some seascape photography, as in this example, you can use the longer shutter speeds to blur the movement of the water. So it takes a bit of trial and error just to kind of work out what the ideal shutter speed is for different scenes when doing long exposures. I tend to roughly start around about 1/4 of a second and then just either increase it a bit and decrease it a bit to see what looks best. So the next setting in the exposure triangle is aperture. So aperture is indicated by an F and then a number after it. So my lens I've got on at the moment is an 18 to 55mm, and it's got an aperture of 3.5 to 5.6. So at 18mm its widest aperture is f3.5, and if I zoom into 55mm its widest aperture will be f5.6. So the smaller number is a wider aperture, letting more light through. A larger number is a smaller aperture, letting less light through. Now the second function is depth of field. So a wider aperture will have a shallower depth of field, which means whatever you focused on behind that will be out of focus and blurred. So I'll use the wider apertures when I'm doing my wildlife photography and photographing a single subject where the background and the stuff around it doesn't matter to me, and you're just trying to get the subject in focus and have it as sharp as possible. So I'll put some example images up so you can see what I mean by shallow depth of field, where the focus is on one main subject and everything else around it and behind it is out of focus and blurred. And we'll say this as well: the distance your subject is from what's behind it makes a difference to the shallow depth of field. If the background's far further away, it'll be completely out of focus, completely blurred. If it's pretty much directly in front of it, you'll still get quite a lot of detail in the background. So if you're wanting to blur out the background a lot, depending on what you're photographing, that separation between your subject and the background will help a lot. Anyway, here are the images. So if you want a greater depth of field, where you want more of your image in acceptable focus from front to back, you'll need to shoot at a smaller aperture. So when I'm doing landscape photography, most of the time I'll be shooting in apertures f8 to f14. This gives me a greater depth of field so that I can get more of my image in focus from front to back. So I'll put up some images now of my landscape photography where hopefully you can see what I mean, and you'll see that the foreground, the midground and the background are all in acceptable focus. As I said in the beginning of the video, I'm just trying to give a very basic overview of these settings. There's a lot more technicality behind aperture, so hopefully this just gives you an understanding, and as you go out with your camera and learn the process more, you can do more research into it as to not to overwhelm yourself in the beginning. But as for now, hopefully this just give you an understanding to the basics of how it works and helps you get out and shoot in manual mode. So the last setting in the exposure triangle is ISO. Just like shutter speed and aperture, it will control the light as well. So as you increase the ISO, the camera will become more sensitive to the light. So there's always a bit of reluctancy in increasing your ISO, simply because high ISO values can affect the image quality, and it'll start to introduce noise into the image, which is kind of like a grainy effect. Now, there's nothing wrong with increasing your ISO. Each camera will be different in how well it handles it. My camera, I don't like to go above ISO 800. So I'll give an example. In this scene, I'm at ISO 100, which is its lowest value, and you can see the quality is fine. And then I've increased it to 800, and the quality is still fine. And then I've just doubled it each time. So in this clip, it's 1600. You'll start to notice the noise appear more in the shadow areas where it'll be underexposed. So for me, in most cases, I've not had to increase my ISO. On the occasions I have, it's been within what I'm comfortable setting it at for my camera. It's just something you'll learn the more you go out with your camera and the more you use it and practice photographing in manual mode. So I hope this video has been helpful, and thank you for watching.